it's Alice, and today we're gonna do a recommendations video all about death books, I guess. I've mentioned this several times, but I really like reading books about death and dying, which is an interest that has sprung from basically being really afraid of it, which I think is something that a lot of people feel. In my world and in my culture, we live lives very removed from death, and I think it's something that a lot of people have a lot of fear around. In my case, I think the fear comes from a sort of ignorance, like you're afraid of something that you don't know. And so usually for me, it helps to sort of learn more about it, and I love reading, and so my way into learning is to read about it. And so a couple of years ago, I started reading books about death, dying, and forensic stuff, medical stuff, and just all kinds of things around death, I guess. And it's really helped me, and so I thought that I would share with you the books that I've read that I've really liked. I do want to do a little disclaimer before we get into these books though. I don't really do disclaimers very often, and it's probably not necessary, but I just want to point out that these books are maybe not for everyone. They're nonfiction and they're based in reality, so everything that you're reading about is real, which does make it a little bit different, and some of the books have a lot of detail, so just bear that in mind. I also have only really read books that are science-based, I guess. I don't really have that much interest in the spiritual aspect of it, so all of these books are about science and forensics and everything to do with like the earthly human experience of it all. I will say though that the books that I'm going to talk about today, all of them have a very respectful tone, and they talk a lot about dignity and respect, and so none of it is offensive in that way. It just, some of the details can be a little bit much for some people, I think. That was a lot of chit chat though. Let's actually get into the books. A lot of the books that I'm going to talk about today are written by some of the same authors, because several of them have written several books about death. And firstly, we have what was my first foray into death books, and it's the books by Caitlin Doughty. I think the first one that I read by her was From Here to Eternity, which blew my mind. I was so fascinated by this. Caitlin Doughty is a mortician, and this book is all about her traveling around the world to figure out how different cultures and different people deal with their dead. Before I read this, I had no idea that there were so many different ways of burying people, I guess, but not all of it is like actual burial. A lot of it is different kinds of customs. Like, I had never heard of sky burials before I read this, and it deals with everything like mummification, embalming, different kinds of cremations, and just all kinds of different ways that people deal with this all over the world. And also it's about how different people process grief and how funeral rites and things like that sort of come into that. Doughty has quite a particular tone in the way that she writes. Like, she has quite a lot of humor in her writing, which I think is something that not everyone would get on with, but she does it really well. I think a little bit of morbid humor every now and then to help sort of break up the harder stuff is great. I think it's necessary, at least for me, and she does it just very well. And I think one of the reasons I like her book so much is that she is very passionate about her field, and it really shines through. She does always focus on dignity and respect though, and the humor wouldn't work if she didn't. Like, if it didn't have a base layer of just immense respect, the humor wouldn't work, but it is there, and so it does work. I've also read her memoir, which is called Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, which focuses on her getting into the funeral industry in the first place. We get to know more about her, where she comes from. It's sort of a coming of age story in a lot of ways, and it's about how she turned her morbid curiosity into her life's work. This is an honest and candid story, and I really liked reading about her life alongside her work. I think the mix of memoir and the exploration of a particular field is very interesting. Like, I think it's a very interesting mix, which you'll see in some of my other recommendations that I'm going to show you today. I just really like this. Again, it was funny and a little bit brutal sometimes. There are a lot of details in this one as well, and it was just very eye-opening. Lastly, by Doughty, we have Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs, which actually, if you're on the younger side or you really do not know a lot about this topic, this might be a good and relatively mild place to start. That's not to say it doesn't have like some details in it, but I'm pretty sure this is geared towards younger audiences, and so it's a little bit lighter in a way. But it does answer a lot of interesting questions like, would your cat eat your eyeballs? The answer is yes. Probably. This is the lighter of the three by far, I would say, but it's still very interesting and informative, and you get answers to all kinds of interesting questions like, can we give grandma a Viking funeral? And will my hair keep growing in my coffin after I'm buried? And all kinds of things you'll get the answers to in here. I will also just add that Caitlin Doughty also has a YouTube channel that I would highly, highly recommend if you like stuff about death, I guess. The channel, like the videos, are basically about death and different cultural practices, the life of a mortician, all kinds of things really. And I've basically watched all of the videos on that channel. Some of them I've even watched several times because I just think it's so interesting. They're also really well made, and you get a taste of like the morbid humor that Caitlin has. I do think that if you don't like her channel, you might not like the humor in these books, but if you do, you're gonna love these. Moving on, the next author I want to recommend, I guess, is Sue Black, who is a professor of anatomy and forensic anthropology. So her work is all about studying mortal remains in her lab and trying to discern what she can from them. All That Remains basically takes a look at her life's work, a lot of the cases that she's worked on, how she worked through them, and what she learned and how it impacted her life. This is very much the type of like memoir slash science book that I think is really great, and in this it works really, really well. We do focus mostly on the work, and Black takes us through cases of natural disasters, accidents, war, and so on, and she also talks quite a lot about how the field of forensic science has developed, which I thought was really interesting. And you do get a look at how it actually is and how it's not at all like you see on TV. Usually it's just way more complicated and you don't get as clear answers as maybe you do on like CSI. And it's very interesting. I also think this is great to read if you're interested in true crime, because there are some true crime cases in here that you get to read about, and if you like getting a little peek behind the curtain, this is great. I really like the way she writes. She's really smart, and even though there is a lot of heavy stuff in this book, she does make it bearable to read about, which I think is important. It's a book about death, yes, but it's also about what working with death has taught the author about life. And it's weird because all kinds of death books that I've read really do always end up being just as much about life as they are about death. The second book by her, I am actually currently reading, but I'm allowing myself to mention it because I feel like I'm far enough in to know that it's going to be as good as All That Remains. It's called Written in Bone, and it's very similar to her other book, except that it's structured around the human skeleton. So in each part, we take a look at a different part of the human skeleton and learn basically all about what that part can tell us. We again take a look at some of the cases that she's worked on, and like I mentioned, we get to take a look at the human skeleton and what different parts can tell us, and also what different parts can tell us in different like times in your life, which I think is very interesting. I could read so many books by this author, to be honest. I just feel like she is an endless fountain of interesting experiences, and she knows so much, and I want to know everything that she knows. Another thing I also really like about Black's books is that she's incredibly professional, but she doesn't shy away from the emotional parts of it, and I think the way she reflects around it is really enlightening. Then we've got another two books that are kind of similar to the books by Sue Black, except they're written by Dr. Richard Shepard, who is a forensic pathologist, which is a different field, but it's just as interesting. The first book that I read by him was Unnatural Causes, which again is a kind of like memoir slash science book. Shepard has had a very, very interesting career, and he has spent basically his lifetime trying to uncover the secrets of the dead, and he has done countless postmortems. We get to take a look at his life and how he got into this field, and we get to take a look at a lot of the cases that he's worked on. A lot of his work has been with like crime and murder and things like that, and it's very interesting to see how his work fits into the solving of a case and how you need to be good at this kind of job. It's very, very meticulous. It also talks a lot about how seeing death on like an everyday basis, like what that does to you as a person and what it does to you to see the darkest parts of humanity. It talks a lot about that and how the work is fulfilling, but it does come at a certain cost. The other book that I read by him, I actually read quite recently. It's The 7 Ages of Death, and like Sue Black's second book, this is also structured a little bit differently than the first book, and it's basically split into different parts of life. So we split a human life into 7 parts, and we get to take a look at cases that are about people who have died in different parts of their lives. It takes a look at what different dangers there are in different ages, so like what you're most likely to die from depending on what age you are, and it takes a look at how our lives show on our bodies, and basically like the lifestyle that you have and the choices that you make show on your body. It shows when you're alive as well, but it also shows when you're dead, which is fascinating and also a little bit worrying, to be honest, but very, very interesting. An interesting thing about this as well is that in the later chapters, the author talks quite a lot about old age and how he himself has reached that age and what it's like to know so much about it and be in that part of your life yourself. It was very, very interesting. An important note about this though is that the old age comes at the end. So the beginning of the book focuses on the very, very young. So just bear that in mind. Then moving on to something a little bit different, we have With the End in Mind by Catherine Mannix. And the full title of this is Dying, Death, and Wisdom in an Age of Denial, which I feel like sums this book up pretty well. The author of this is a doctor who worked for over 30 years in palliative care, and she basically uses her experience to sort of discuss the different sides of it and what death is like in the modern world. We get to meet several different people in this book, and we get to see all kinds of different situations, but a common thing about the stories in this book is that everyone who we read about, at least most of them, know that they're going to die. And it's a lot about how to deal with that and all of the emotions that come with it and how people around can help, and also how people around those people who are dying, how they react. It's a lot about the feelings around it and how a lot of people have the same feelings, and whatever feeling you have, it's all valid. A thing I really like about this book is that it really delves into how removed we are from death in our modern world and how it's a thing that we don't ever really think about and we don't face unless we're forced to. And that makes it really scary, and it doesn't have to be. I found this to be a surprisingly calming book. It has a different kind of feel to it because the cases in here are different than in a lot of the other books that I've mentioned today. Like, this is more personal in a way because we get to hear from the people who are dying and they're in like the actual process of it, but it is very peaceful in a lot of ways. And I think that this is an important book because this is what it's like for most people. And a lot of the cases in here are of older people who are coming to the end of their lives and they know that the end is coming. And, you know, hopefully, I think that's what everyone hopes for in a way. And it's probably the stuff that's the most relevant, and it's very interesting. Second to last, we have got a straight up memoir. It's When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi, and this is quite different than all the other books because it's written from the perspective of a person who knows that he's dying, which makes it entirely different. The author of this was diagnosed with untreatable cancer right before he was about to finish his training as a neurosurgeon. And so the book is about how his work is about death, and now he is dying, and so he has to face his own death. And it's a lot about that and life and just how to come to terms with what's happening to you. A very interesting thing about this book as well is that, like, it's been a while since I read this book, but a part that really stuck with me is about him going from being a doctor to becoming a patient and sort of the overlap of it and what it's like to be in the process of dying when you're a doctor and you know more than a lot of people do. And I thought that that process was very interesting, and it's obviously a hard book to read because he did pass away, and so you sort of read for as long as he could write, you get to read about it, and it's tough, but it's a very interesting perspective. I also have to say that the afterword of this book, written by his wife, is just, oh, it's so beautiful, but so heartbreaking. Lastly, we have a book in Norwegian that I read very recently, and unfortunately, there is no English or any translation of this book, so this is for my fellow Norwegians. It's En 60 Under by Tor Håkon Gabriel Håvardsen, and this is basically the memoir of a funeral director here in Norway and how he got into the field and what his work is like. Funeral directors, like, that job entails different things in different places, but for him it means that he goes to pick up bodies, he gets them ready for burials, he's at the funeral, he plans the funeral, he deals with relatives, he does it all. And these people, they see a lot. This is honest and kind of brutal in parts, but like Caitlin Doughty's books, they're honest but respectful and funny, which I appreciate because I think that cracking a little joke does make reading about decomposition slightly less horrifying. Okay, everyone, those are all my recommendations for today, and yeah, I do realize that this topic and these books are not for everyone, but I also know that there are some other people out there like me who would appreciate these recommendations, so if you're one of those, here you go. And I would also love some recommendations if anyone has any, like, death book recommendations. Do leave a comment if you have one, because I'm always looking for more to read. As always, thank you very much for hanging out with me today, and I will see you soon. Bye!